I have a little story to tell you. When I was in the oil fields and we were working doing CO2 frac jobs, at the end of one frac job, we had a half a truckload left of liquid CO2. We didn't want to send it back to the supplier, so we dumped it. And this was in the 80s, and that's what you did in the 80s. So we backed the truck up to the edge of the drilling location, opened the valve, and it flowed out. Liquid CO2, it flashed to a gas, it flowed down the hill. It was a cool, humid day, and you could actually see this cloud of CO2 gas. Sometime later, after it dispersed, I got the landowner. I was the site supervisor. I got the landowner. We walked down the hill, and there were dead and dying prairie dogs everywhere. You've seen prairie dog towns. They're pretty dense, and they live in holes in the ground. And this fluid flowed down the hill, and there were dead and dying prairie dogs everywhere. And the landowner commented, "Might be a good way to get rid of prairie dogs." It continues to flow downhill until it disperses. The time and distance to dispersal depends on a lot of factors, including the lay of the land, uphill, downhill, the temperature of the air. The warmer it is, the faster it disperses. The wind strength and wind direction. In South Dakota, the wind always blows, and it blows from every direction we have. The size of the rupture, literally the hole in the pipeline. The quantity of the rupture, how much comes out of the pipeline, the humidity, and even things like if there's corn standing in the field. All of those variables need to be taken into account in order to predict where it's going to go. In the event of light winds or winds blowing up a hill, it's going to disperse much more slowly. It's not going to go as far, but where it is will be at a higher concentration. At the point of the release, the atmospheric concentrations can be 100%. Almost any breach in a CO2 pipeline will result in the entire contents of that pipeline between the safety valves being released. It's going to leak until the pressure inside the pipeline is down to 1 atmosphere, down to ambient pressure. The Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Act in October 5, 2022, published their final rule that says in a high consequence area, and the definition of that is somewhat bureaucratic, but it means where people live, areas where there are high consequences. Valve spacing must not exceed 15 miles in areas that could affect HCAs, the high consequence areas. It must not exceed 20 miles in areas that could not affect HCA. For 20 miles, that's 138,000 gallons a mile, 2.7 million gallons of liquid CO2. At 15 miles, that's 2.1 million gallons of liquid CO2. Keep in mind that liquid CO2 expands to a gas at about a ratio of 500 to 1. And I say about because there's temperature and humidity concerns that go with that. So it's about. That's a lot of gas. I don't know if you've heard about the pipeline release in Sarsia, Mississippi. In the interest of time, I'll kind of jump through this a little bit. It released, it blew a hole in the ground, it self-excavated a pit about 40 feet around, a 24-inch pipeline. The pipeline broke because it was going down a road embankment, and it was poorly designed, actually, from a geologist standpoint. The soil moved, the pipeline ruptured, the entire width of the pipeline ruptured. Metallurgical analysis after that showed 2 modes of rupture. One was a ductile failure, and ductility is where the metal bends before it breaks. And there were brittle failures, and the brittle failure was due to the cold that this steel was associated with. It got so cold that it became brittle and just broke. Sarsia was not included in the affected radius in the public awareness program. Literally nobody in the town and nobody in that county really knew what was going on. In fact, people called in to 911, and 911 was informed that it was a natural gas release. And they thought it was natural gas because there was a little bit of hydrogen sulfide associated with this particular liquid CO2, and people could smell it, thought it was natural gas. It wasn't natural gas. The Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Act report, and I'm going to just read this quote. In the worst case scenario for a rupture of a 12-inch pipeline with wind speed of 4.5 miles per hour and atmospheric stability, the CO2 cloud reaches 50,000 parts per million, 1,500 feet from the location of the rupture, 20,000 parts per million, 2,200 feet from the rupture, and 5,000 at 4,000 feet from the rupture. The dispersion model that they had done didn't include the areas that were ultimately infected. Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Act report goes on to say, for the releases modeled in this report, the maximum extents occur within 10 minutes after the initial release. That was shocking to me. When you think about 10 minutes from the time of the release to the time where it reached its maximum extent, that's not long. Nobody died. 200 thereabouts, 200 people were hospitalized, and there was one person that was still unconscious 45 minutes after the release. It released 1,319,000 gallons of liquid CO2. That brings me to setbacks. How do you determine setbacks? The state of Illinois, the Illinois Commerce Commission, did a really deep dive on this. And they had testimony from a number of different experts. And the boil down of that testimony is there's two ways to figure setbacks. One is a model, a computer model that you can run on your home computer, essentially, that models gas flow. The other is a thing called computational fluid dynamics, which is very, very difficult to run, which models the fluid, the liquid, which is what comes out of the pipeline. The expert said, predictions made using the gas model are unable to incorporate critical factors necessary to determine the risk that pipelines present to communities and underpredict downstream concentrations. He recommends computational fluid dynamics as the gold standard. Unfortunately, they're very hard to run. They require a lot of computer power. Remember all the things you have to account for: the topography, the wind speed, the wind direction, the amount of the release, the rate of the release, the humidity. There's a lot of variables that have to be taken into account to be able to predict along the length of any pipeline where it's going to go. An anecdotal reference from a guy in Great Britain that does this said for this pipeline it would take 44 years of computer time to perform the necessary dispersion analysis in order to accurately and safely predict dispersion. The law says that the dispersion analysis has to be submitted to the PUC. My question to the PUC is, who do they have on their board, or where are they going to find someone that has the credentials in order to be able to determine if that dispersion analysis is scientifically correct? How am I doing for time? 1 minute? I'm going to jump right to some questions that landowners should ask. Will I be informed if I'm in a potentially affected area but I'm not a property owner? Will a dispersion analysis be made public? Supposedly no. How will I be notified of a release? Will the notification include the location of the release so I can judge my individual risk? What will be the timing of the notification? From whom will I receive this notification? If there's a release, how will I be compensated if I am indeed injured? If I see a release, how do I do this? I call 911? How ready are my local authorities to deal with the release? I can tell you, I know a bunch of those guys, and they're not ready to respond to a release like this. In Sarsia, they drove their fire trucks into the cloud and all the fire trucks quit because there wasn't enough oxygen to keep the motor going. Finally, what happens when the pipeline ends operation? Will it stay in the ground? Am I over yet? Okay. A couple questions about the legislation. And these are technical questions, not policy questions. It says it has to be buried 48 inches deep. What monitoring will there be to ensure that it stays 48 inches deep? The depth below the river bottom is stated. How do we determine the depth of the river bottom? That's a moving target. I'm done.
Thank you very much for respecting the cues of the moderator and to cease speaking when your time is up. Our next speaker will be Trent Luce as an opponent to the pipeline.
My first question was, I was wondering how I would know exactly when to quit. Now I know. It's not the dinner bell. It's time to shut up, Trent. So I'm in my 25th year of broadcasting on a radio program called Loose Tales. I lived in South Dakota on the Rosebud Reservation when I started Loose Tales. And the goal was to tell the story of the importance of American agriculture to an urbanizing population that didn't understand that food production and energy and fuel of a domestic supply is vitally important to our national security. And it's been quite a run. In that 25-year period of time, I've spoken on 4 continents and two audiences in 48 different states with the same premise. How do we explain domestic food, fuel, and fiber production as a means of national security? The great irony is that if we look around this room and we look around the great agricultural state of South Dakota, as much as I started by taking on the animal rights community and ultimately the environmental community, and I tried to explain to them the true environmentalists are those of us that get our hands dirty, taking care of God's creation, improving it, and improving mankind. In my case, it's my wife, because I've already told you I'm never home. And I'm often asked, well, how big can your ranch be in central Nebraska? You're never there. It's just as big as my wife can handle. Did not envision standing in front of an audience, a great audience of people all impassioned about the future of American agriculture, and we're not on the same page. So you have to ask yourself, why aren't we on the same page about an industry that we're all involved in? You know, when I see there's an animal rights convention, when I started 24 years ago in Washington, D.C. or L.A., I went there because I wanted to see the people. I wanted to meet the people. And you know what I always found? There was always a big pile of money that were using people to further a cause when they didn't really understand what that cause was. All I know is that I grew up loving animals, want to be a veterinarian. I couldn't get to vet school, so I wanted to find a way to help animals, and I found this big purse to help me do and lived my dream of helping animals. And they didn't understand what the challenge was to the animal. They just knew they had somebody funding them. And ironically, here we are in 2024 fighting about issues like CO2 pipelines, like about the county's ability to govern itself instead of here with a heavy hand or Washington, D.C. telling us what to do. And guess what I've learned? The same people who were funding those animal rights groups, using those young girls so passionately, are funding the division within our agricultural communities. So then you have to ask, why is that happening? Because we have a certain segment of the population sitting on the left side of me who have been convinced that if they don't take this subsidy money, where we now as American citizens owe the federal government $107,000, that we're not going to keep in place one of those domestic supplies of food and fuel that we need, which is ethanol. But who that supports ethanol has dug into who's the big money machine behind? We just heard from Tim, and I could walk, and I've spent through 2.5, nearly 3 years on this topic, and he didn't get to the real danger of a CO2 pipeline. How many of you know, just up the road, how Dakota Provisions euthanizes their turkeys. CO2 chamber. I've been there. And what's the percentage of CO2 in that chamber, Tim? Do you know? 7%. 7,000. Has anybody seen the proposed map of CO2 pipelines by 2050 put forth by Princeton University? You happen to live right there in the middle of a CO2 chamber. And if we're talking about the true risk of a CO2 chamber, and this is something that I've worked on not just in South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa. I was in Illinois when that study you talked about was released. At the Farm Progress Show, we made it available. I got a phone call from Representative Kim Coates the other day from Louisiana, because you didn't mention the CO2 rupture that happened in Louisiana 3 months ago. Kim Coates called me in a panic. She said, Trent, this CO2 pipeline has erupted. The local volunteer firefighters have no idea what to do. Who do I turn them to? I said, Dan Harvey at Groover, Iowa, is the guy who has the most experience in knowing what to do, because the local fire department doesn't know. Because as he mentioned, all of the first responders' vehicles froze up and put them in risk of dying in Sarsha, Mississippi. There was a CO2 rupture in a pipeline 3 weeks ago in Texas. In Texas, we've had 100 earthquakes in the past 30 days. In October 31st last fall, I was called to a Senate and House Joint Committee meeting at the State House in Oklahoma because they said, Trent, we've got an accelerated rate of earthquakes in Oklahoma. What's going on with this? I said, well, you're injecting fluids into Earth. The U.S. Geological Service says if you inject fluids into Earth, you're going to cause earthquakes. Cornell University said August of last year that we were wrong. Volcanoes are not caused by water coming through the Earth's surface. In fact, we've determined that it is CO2 coming through the Earth's surface causing volcanoes that have erupted all over the world. And they want us to live in the middle of a CO2 chamber. Who's they? Who is they? Who does Dan Lederman take money from every month from the state of South Dakota as a registered lobbyist for? Saudi Arabia. Who does LS2, the lobbying entity for Summit Carbon Solutions, take money from to the tune of $1.5 million? I have an embassy of Saudi Arabia receipt to show you that the lobbying entity for Summit Carbon Solution is directly financially tied to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wants to be the #1 country in the world on fertilizer production, in artificial intelligence production, and fuel. And I'll cut to the chase because I've figured out what's happened. Saudi Arabia is using useful idiots to do their bidding to put every single ethanol plant in a contract that is obligated to Summit Carbon Solutions, and that contract, Ed Fishbach says, they can sell it to whoever they want to at any point in time. Do you want to read that later? Maybe, probably. Why? And instead of asking these pertinent questions, I'm driving on Highway 20 through Schuyler, Nebraska, watching the day that the SB 201 is being discussed. And I hear this guy, Representative Roger Chase, say, the people of my counties don't want this. I know what's best for them. I'm going to get them more money. It's my money. It's their money. We live in a representative republic where the people we put in here are supposed to represent the will of the people, and that's not happened, particularly in Spink and Beadle County. And I called Jim Seaver, and I said, I want to talk to you because I'm getting calls from your co-op members that tell me we want to know what the contract is with Summit, and the very co-op members, which I understand the board is here, will not share the deal with their own members. A membership organization is owned by the farmer members. Why the secret? Why no transparency? Because you're doing the bidding for a foreign country. And I will not stand by and allow that to continue to happen. I have much more details. I have 20 copies of this map. I can get you all of the information to verify anything that I have said. And what I do know is that we have to figure out what's really important. I go into high school in York, Nebraska the other day, and I said, you know, they want to put CO2 in a mile and a half deep in Earth. Why? Well, because it causes global warming. Tim just told us that they couldn't touch the metal because it was frozen and they make dry ice out of CO2. How does dry ice making CO2 making dry ice cause the Earth to warm? And by the way, 330 gigatons of CO2 generated by the Earth's or the ocean's activities annually, and man generates 37 gigatons. Thank you.
Thank you, Trent. Our next speaker will be Representative Roger Chase. Please give him a round.
No, I don't want to clip that on. It'll sit right there. Good evening, everyone. I am Representative Roger Chase. I am from Huron, representing Beetle County, District 22, which is all of Beetle, Spink, and a small portion of Clark County. I have been a legislator for the past 8 years, and I was invited tonight to come to a panel discussion on Referred Law 21, which is basically trying to put to a public vote Senate Bill 201. Questioning whether my opponents, did they bring the bill tonight? Have they read the bill? You have? Okay. I'm going to go through the bill tonight because that's basically what you're voting on come November or any time between now and then. I want to make sure that you understand that, to me, Senate Bill 201 was a compromise bill. The carbon pipeline discussion has been an active discussion in the South Dakota legislature for the past 2 years. There has been a number of bills pertaining to all kinds of different legislation, regulating, monitoring, determining whether this could be built, eminent domain, the rights of landowners, whatever the case might be. Through a compromise, this was not a backdoor deal. This was not done in secrecy. This was discussed. There's several legislators here tonight that can tell you that this was discussed throughout legislative committees, talked about, bill form, brought to committees, discussed, negotiated, testified about, both pro and con. Senate Bill 201 passed the legislature. It's been referred to a public vote. You, the people, are going to decide whether this moves forward. The important thing to remember is that if this bill is repealed, it takes away some of the stipulations, the depth of the pipe, the plume studies, things that we looked at as protectionisms for the people of the state of South Dakota. I'm just going to go through the bill and kind of talk to you about some of the things as it exists. First of all, I want to talk about the number of pipeline miles within the state of South Dakota will be public information to the counties that they run those miles of CO2 pipeline through. The number, the location, the size, and cost of each pumping station within those particular areas. I'm going to bounce around a little bit here. We're going to get to the protectionisms. Right now, 48 inches is the depth of the pipe that will be required for the CO2 pipelines to be buried. For those of you that have signed an easement agreement, negotiated between you and Summit, if you've negotiated the pipe depth of your farm, 5 feet, 6 feet, that is the contract, that is the depth that that pipe will be. But the pipe will be a minimum of 48 inches. Has to be. The operator of the pipeline facility carrying the carbon dioxide is liable for repairs of the drain tile which was installed prior to the installation of any of the pipeline facility. That continues for the life of the pipeline facility, covers full replacement costs, including, without limitations, material, labor, and equipment. It also includes reclamation and restoration of topsoil. If anything that they do to touch that topsoil during the installation of the pipe or any time after that, it gets back to total restoration. An operator of a pipeline facility carrying CO2 shall be liable for all damages resulting from the installation, construction, operation, maintenance, repairs, leaks, ruptures, and other failures of the pipeline facility. The operator shall indemnify and hold the surface owner harmless of any loss, claim, or damage resulting from the installation, construction, operation, maintenance, repair, leaks, ruptures, and other failures of the pipeline facility, other than gross negligence or willful misconduct by the surface owner. An operator of the pipeline facility carrying carbon dioxide must include an agricultural impact mitigation plan and its application for a permit under this chapter. Now we're talking about PUC. An operator of the pipeline facility carrying carbon dioxide must offer a dispersion analysis into evidence before the Commission, the PUC. The Commission may enter into an order declaring such dispersion analysis or a portion of the dispersion analysis confidential, or any order declaring dispersion analysis or a portion of the dispersion analysis as confidential must be justified in specific findings in writing and/or of record. Here's where it gets a little interesting. The PUC Commission must make the dispersion model available in relevant part to each applicable county, emergency management, and law enforcement agency. The Commission may make the available dispersion analysis public. The land agent that's working on behalf of a pipeline has to be a South Dakota resident or licensed within the state of South Dakota. Those are some of the main things that we want to make sure that we protect for the landowners, but most importantly, one thing that I wanted to bring forth today was in Senate Bill 201 is taxation and revenue for the counties. Now last year, folks, I led a legislative summer study talking about county funding. And we came up with several solutions and some ideas of what we could do to help counties offset some expenses. And this particular discussion was not part of our study. This was not a conclusion of our study. When we talked about the importance of getting this pipeline done and what it does to help counties, we decided to put in a surcharge that there will be $1 per lineal foot of each line in the counties that this is affected in South Dakota. It affects 23 counties in eastern South Dakota, ladies and gentlemen. That $1 linear foot gets split two ways. 50 cents of that dollar goes to the landowner that owns that land where the pipeline is located. The other 50 cents goes to the county in which it's in. And that money can be used for whatever they choose to do. It could buy a new fleet of sheriff's cars. It could buy a new fire truck. It could remodel the courthouse. It could improve the jail. It can be used to whatever discretion the county chooses to do. And we felt that that was an important thing to do. If Senate Bill 201 goes away, that goes away. That revenue source for those counties goes away, plus all of the protections that we've talked about with Senate Bill 201. Senate Bill 201 had two complementary sister bills, House Bill 1185 and House Bill 1186. And those passed. They were not referred. 1185 deals with surveying, and 1186 deals with the fact that if a pipeline company ceases operation after 5 years, the pipeline is shut down, and they've got 5 years in which to, and the other part of it is they've got 5 years in which to get the pipeline project moving and functional. That's what Senate Bill 201 is. That's our forum discussion as far as I'm concerned. The rest of this is immaterial. As far as pipelines in South Dakota, there are thousands of miles of pipelines available in South Dakota right now, carrying crude oil, refined gasoline and diesel fuel, natural gas. I drove from Huron to Brookings today, and I drove over crude oil lines and I drove over natural gas lines. I basically know where they're at, but if you didn't know where they're at, you could not tell that at some point the ground was disturbed and a pipeline was installed. And to finalize, folks, this particular project impacts me and my family. My farm is 1 mile north of the ethanol plant in Huron, South Dakota, a plant that this man's company owns. I'm an investor owner in Glacial Lakes. I believe that we as agriculturalists provide food, fiber, and fuel now for our nation and for our growing world. It's important that we look forward to the future and make sure that we've got that done. Summit Carbon Solutions contacted me 3 years ago. I negotiated and talked with them. And after a 6-month dialogue, working back and forth, I signed an easement to work with them and allow them to put a pipeline on my property. Summit did not condemn my land. Summit did not take my land. I agreed to allow Summit to have an easement to go across my land to place a pipe. I made that decision with my son, who's the next generation on the farm. He understands the importance of the economics of farming today. He's a young 31-year-old trying to get established to carry on the farm that we've worked so hard to form. Corn today is at $3.50. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not feasible, it's not functional, it's not financially viable. We need to look at other sources to make sure that we as young people in farming and agriculture in South Dakota can move forward. I ask that you vote yes on Referred Law 21. It protects the farmers. Take the emotion out of it one way or the other, folks. Take the emotion out of it. Senate Bill 201 was good for us. Referred Law 21, you should vote yes. I ask that you do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Chase. Our next speaker will be economist and opponent Doyle Turner.
So I would like to point out that I really think the common ground here is the fact that nobody here wants to hurt ethanol. Everybody here wants to see ethanol succeed. The difference is, how do we do that? And I have to commend these gentlemen that it takes a lot of guts to come up here and to talk to people who have owned land, that they know that their actions are affecting other people's land against their choice. And it takes a lot of courage to come up here and say that in order for South Dakota agriculture to be viable, in order for your farm to be viable, you're going to have to rely on a government-subsidized landfill. Folks, sequestration is nothing more than a fancy term for a landfill. I don't know about you, but I've never gone to the landfill and came home and felt like, wow, I'm economically viable now. So Roger talked about $3.50 corn. The subsidies for this boondoggle could ultimately reach $3.71 a bushel. When you take all the money they're going to pay for this pipeline, for the landfill, to the ethanol plants, and you divide it by the number of bushels that the ethanol plants use, it's $3.71 a bushel. I think you just said the local price for corn is $3.50. Ethanol uses 40% of our corn, folks. Do we really want to spend our tax dollars to give 40% of our crop away just to get the same ethanol we've always been getting for 20 years? That doesn't make economic sense. We are using our children's and grandchildren's money to put a very valuable commodity in the ground. You know, if we are going to be productive in our agriculture, the number one thing we have to do is add value. This CO2 is 98% pure. It is the holy grail of CO2, because within the industry, most industrial CO2 is between 10 and 12% CO2, or 10 to 12% CO2. We have a serious opportunity here. I invested in a company years ago that was selling CO2. Wasn't the most profitable company, wasn't the best investment I made, but they were making money selling CO2. What's going on here is the ethanol plants have an opportunity to work with companies that will take the CO2, make it into methanol, possibly make the methanol into SAF, and it will lower their carbon index the same way the pipeline will. What's the real motivator here? Folks, if they go with the ethanol plant, they have no investment. They don't have to put up a dime. The only thing they have to pay is to give your rights to your property away. You know, the problem here is that this is not a legal taking, not only because it's private eminent domain for private gain, but it's the fact that it's not necessary. You know, it may be the safest way to transport CO2, but you want to know what's more safe? Not transporting CO2. Make this... The last I knew, we built ethanol plants to add value to corn. The CO2 roughly amounts to 1/3 of the corn. We have an opportunity to add value to it. Companies like BlackRock want the CO2. We are handing over a monopoly by allowing this pipeline to take the CO2 out of our states. Navigator actually admitted to one of my county supervisors that eventually all of this CO2 would be made into methanol. And it will. Because let's face it, they're only taking the biological CO2. They aren't mixing the other CO2 in with it. Because let's face it, Summit knows what this CO2 is worth. If we are going to get ahead as a state, we have to add value to everything. And CO2 is that way. By them allowing to essentially take welfare dollars for not doing anything, we are allowing a valuable commodity to leave our state with no value added to it. You know, I compare it to Africa. If you look at Africa, Africa is the wealthiest continent in the world with natural resources. But if you take all of the GDP of all of the countries in Africa and add them together, they're only 57% of the GDP of Japan. The interesting thing is, Japan doesn't really have any natural resources. Folks, if we want to bring our children back to the farm, we are going to have to create opportunity, not just take welfare. So I'm a firm believer that just saying no isn't an answer. I completely agree that the ethanol plants, they have a real challenge. The world that they are living in, their rights are being harmed every bit as bad as our property rights are being harmed. The government is telling them you have to do business this way or you won't be able to sell a product and you won't be able to do it profitable. Folks, that is completely wrong. And if we're going to stand up to this, I would call on the ethanol plants and the people to fight the GREET model. That's G-R-E-E-T. And that is what regulates this whole voodoo math that is dictating this carbon capture thing. The Chevron case was reversed by the Supreme Court, and we have a real opportunity, if we would work together, to fight that, to find that the GREET model and Argonne Labs' dictatorial efforts to control our industries are unconstitutional. I'd also like to say that the reason we are fighting RL21, the reason we want to say no, is because it takes away local control. And the simple fact of the matter is, our best representation comes from that local part. It doesn't matter whether it's Pierre, or if it's Des Moines, or if it's Washington, D.C. The most amount of representation, the greatest amount of representation, when you take the number of people representing you at your county level, they represent the smallest group of people. And that allows them to be much more connected to what those people need. South Dakota is an extremely diverse state. You have extremes from one end to the other geologically. There is no way that people in Pierre can come together and understand those intricacies. Yet your counties and your townships, they have the ability to connect with the people and understand your uniqueness. That's why we need to say we need to vote no on RL 21, and we need to keep Pierre out of local control of our lives. So I'm a firm believer that just saying no isn't an answer. So I found two companies, Carbon Sink LLC and Cap CO2, who are willing to build methanol plants at each and every ethanol plant so that we don't need a pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you, Doyle. Our next speaker is Jim Sire. Please give him a round.
My name is Jim Sire, CEO at Glacier Lakes Energy, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. I'm here to talk about the importance of the ethanol industry to agriculture, to Brookings County, to South Dakota, to every Corn Belt state, and to the entire country. Via the Renewable Fuel Standard, or the RFS, the ethanol industry has created new demand, new markets, and new wealth for American agriculture exactly the way it was intended. The impact of this industry on the demand and the price of corn is unmistaken and has pulled other commodity values up as well. Historical corn futures prior to the RFS averaged approximately $2.65 a bushel. Since the RFS, historical corn futures have averaged just under $4 a bushel, an increase of 51%. And these are USDA statistics, folks. It's a fact that the RFS has created, since its inception, billions of dollars in wealth for every landowner and producer engaged in agriculture. It's a fact that the RFS has created billions of dollars in wealth for large and small businesses tied to agriculture. It's a fact that the RFS has created billions of dollars in new tax revenue for Corn Belt states whose financial health and well-being is dependent upon agriculture. It's a fact that the build-out of the ethanol industry that's occurred over the past 20 years is the best thing that's happened to agriculture ever. More recently, the RFS has had the same impact on the demand and price for oil seeds, specifically soybean oil, as refiners scramble to meet the demand of low-carbon diesel fuel markets in California, Canada, and other regions. It's a fact that the RFS is nothing more than another government program, a boondoggle, as some in this room would call it, a boondoggle. The RFS was intended to boost production of domestic feedstocks, reduce our country's dependence on foreign oil, and reduce harmful vehicle emissions. It's a boondoggle. Why are we even supporting the RFS? It's a boondoggle. Government policy and tax incentives are created to boost important initiatives, drive consumer behavior, and respond to consumer preferences. Consumer preferences and demand. I want you to think about that. Like the RFS, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 was created to encourage the production of clean transportation fuels with a focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is a gift for the ethanol industry. It's a gift for everybody in this room that depends on agriculture. It's well documented and no secret that large population-centered consumers and our future generations, even right here in this state of South Dakota, are demanding and place a high value on reducing greenhouse gases and lowering our carbon impact on this planet. If you don't believe that, you've got your head in the sand. It's happening in Sioux Falls, it's happening in Denver, it's happening even in the smaller towns as the new generation comes up and places a higher value on a lower CI impact, carbon intensity impact. These markets just aren't regional or national. They are global. When consumers demand that products meet their specifications and preferences, companies and industries such as ours, and all of agriculture, for that matter, needs to pay attention. Low carbon beef. Are you just going to ignore that because you don't agree with it? Is that a question? Alternatives are very few and really very simple. We either dig in, ignore market preferences, and gradually become irrelevant, or give the market a product that they demand and will pay a premium for. Which route do you suppose once famous names such as Kodak, Blockbuster, Kmart, BlackBerry took? Do we even know what those companies do anymore? What about the Bud Light fiasco 18 months ago? Total ignoring what its customer base wanted. All the companies learned the hard way not to ignore the demands of its consumers. The ethanol industry can survive these new market preferences, and we can compete, but we must innovate and adapt to consumer demands, the most significant of which is lowering our CI score. Without carbon capture, the South Dakota ethanol industry will be at a competitive disadvantage to companies which can do so. Without a significant adaptation to market demands, ethanol will miss out on opportunities such as sustainable aviation fuel. The ship's leaving shore, folks. If we aren't on that ship, somebody's going to fill that void, which is a sustainable aviation fuel market is a market much larger than ethanol. At Glacier Lakes Energy, we are already seeing plants with a significantly lower CI score capitalize on more lucrative markets than we can. South Dakota SAF will not be competitive without carbon capture, and our corn producers will miss out on an incredible opportunity to continue the success of our past. Without carbon capture, the South Dakota ethanol industry, which has been agriculture's best success ever, faces an uncertain future and will eventually become irrelevant. This won't happen overnight, but like any industry or business who fails to innovate and adapt, it will happen. We won't get there next month or next year, but we could be there 10 years from now. So, 2 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. at an industry conference, and I probably have the same impression of Washington, D.C. than almost everybody in this room. We heard a speaker, his name is Ernie Moniz, former energy secretary, talk about some of the work that he's doing. And I want you to write this down. He currently heads up the Energy Futures Initiative Foundation, and he's written a white paper titled A Strategic Roadmap for Decarbonizing the Ethanol Industry. A strategic roadmap for decarbonizing the ethanol industry. Here are a couple of quotes, and actually I have a copy of it right here. All you have to do is Google this, a strategic roadmap for decarbonizing the ethanol industry. You'll find it. Here are a couple of direct quotes from Mr. Munez. Global weather events are helping drive low carbon initiatives. Private sector and large corporations, not government, are driving the U.S. global movement towards low-carbon initiatives. This is not the government that's asking for a low-carbon product, folks. It's the public. It's the consumers. It's the next generation. The outcome of the election could change the pace of the low-carbon economy, okay? Trump gets elected, it might slow things down, but it won't change the direction. That's the prediction of Mr. Muniz. Ethanol is a demonstrated leader in the transition to low-carbon fuels. That's a direct quote from this man. And I think you'll find that in this study. The idea of electricity only is being gradually replaced by a realization that renewable fuels can play a major role in lowering fossil fuels' CI score. There is a huge opportunity for ethanol here. This hinges on the ethanol's industry become a net zero emissions fuel, and this study clearly indicates an important dedication in Washington, D.C. to finding a role for the ethanol industry in a low-carbon economy. Now, when you really think about the Inflation Reduction Act and the 45Z, it was made for ethanol. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. We will now go into question and answer. If you have a question to submit, you can tear off the bottom form of your handout and you can hand it to one of the hosts around the room, or you can bring it up here, whatever you want to do. We will read your question and direct it to the appropriate panelist. Also, Tim, you will be coming up if questions are for you. I ask you to please speak into the microphone so that it can be picked up in the back, okay? All right.
Are we answering questions here?
Yes. You test your mic and make sure it works. Pull it forward.
Testing.
Okay, first question. Clint or Craig?
This is directed to Roger, since he brought the bill, helped build the bill. Please read the first 3 sentences of Section 6 of the bill. Explain how this will not take away county, township, or municipality rights.
Okay, this question was directed to Representative Chase. He has 2 minutes to answer, and the opponents will have 2 minutes to rebut.
Thank you for can you hear me, folks? Thank you for the question. Question 6, or Section 6 in Bill 201 deals with local zoning. And just let me read it real quick. A permit of the construction and transmission facility within a designated area supersedes or preempts any county, township, municipal, and or other governmental unit, land use, zoning, or building rule, regulation, or ordinance. Basically, the enforcement of any county, municipal, township, or other governmental unit, rule, regulation, or ordinance of a transmission facility permitted under this chapter, again permitted by the PUC granting the permit. I have a couple of different documents here that will tell you that we didn't take anything away from local governments because they never had it to begin with. Here, no, folks, let me read this. Let me read this from the Department of Transportation, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Federal preemption of pipeline safety means that states do not have the independent authority to regulate pipeline safety, but derive that authority from the federal law throughout the certification of PHMSA. In the case of local governments that are not subject to federal certification of pipeline safety authority, they may still exercise the powers granted to them under state law, but none of them adopt the enforced pipeline safety standards contradictory to federal law. Federal pipeline safety law impinges on these traditional prerogatives of local or state government, so long as the officials do not attempt to regulate the fields of pipeline safety preemption. One other area that I want to spotlight, and this comes from Brigham McNone, who is the former administration from PHMSA, and his argument down here is, just let me read this real quickly. Setbacks are...
Stop. Thank you. Rebuttal?
So I would like to rebut to, there was a letter that PHMSA wrote to the CEO of Summit Carbon Solutions. It went to Lee Blank. Congress has vested PHMSA, which regulates the pipelines, with authority to regulate the design, construction, operation, and maintenance of pipeline systems, including carbon dioxide pipelines, and to protect life, property, and environment from hazards associated with pipeline operations. While the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has exclusive authority to regulate the siting of the interstate gas transmission lines, there is no equivalent federal agency that determines siting of all other pipelines, such as carbon dioxide pipelines. Therefore, the responsibility for siting new carbon dioxide pipelines rests largely with the individual states and counties through which the pipelines will operate and is governed by state and local law.
Thank you.
So,
Next.
folks, I still have some time.
You still have some time? 1 minute.
So, folks, it's really disturbing that the gentleman responsible for writing laws in your state doesn't understand that the agency that they keep saying has authority over this is the agency that's saying they don't have authority. Now, here's the deal. If the state is passing this off and they're saying the counties doesn't have the authority and the state doesn't have the authority, and PHMSA is saying that they don't have the authority, we are allowing a company that has never built a pipeline, doesn't own a mile of pipeline, to self-regulate. There is no possible way this is responsible government.
Next question.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Speak up.
This is for Jim. If
Jim.
If CO2 capture is a gift, isn't it a gift from my pocket to your pocket, since it's our taxpayer money you and Summit are getting rich on?
If you're a landowner in South Dakota, you're already enjoying the benefit of the ethanol industry. If this industry fails, you're going to pay for it.
Rebuttal? 2 minutes.
I know for a fact there are farmers in here that live and operate and raise corn close to an ethanol plant. Why is it that your corn closest to the ethanol plant is a higher yielding per bushel than the corn away from the ethanol plant? Because as any fifth grader would tell you, CO2 is a plant food, not an, I quote, harmful emission. There are 4 harmful emissions according to the EPA. CO2 would be one of those. Methane would be one of those. We make nitrogen for plants and food out of methane. It's 92% of natural gas is methane. Nitric oxide is one of those, 78% in the Earth's atmosphere. It is ultimately plant food. And the favorite one that I like to talk about, sulfur oxide. You don't need to raise your hand, but how many people have never put sulfur in their fertilizer mix until 2006, when the EPA said we're going to take sulfur out of diesel and make it low sulfur diesel, and now we're short of sulfur in the atmosphere. Every single one of the gases that they deem to be, I quote, harmful emissions are actually all involved in plant food. Net carbon zero is death, and if we want to continue to head towards death, we're on a different page than I am.
Next question, please.
Directed to Roger.
Roger?
Have you forgotten who you work for? Have you listened to the people of South Dakota?
Thanks again for the question. Just before I begin to answer that one, it's interesting that Doyle and I were reading from the same letter, just different pages on the previous question. No, I haven't forgotten who I work for, because over 70% of the people in the state of South Dakota, the landowners, that have already signed voluntary easements to provide land to the pipeline.
Order.
No, there was no duress involved with mine. I voluntarily spoke or gave it to them under compensation, just compensation, and I looked to... Sir?
Order, please. Please. Go ahead.
You know, to answer the question, no, I've not forgotten, because there's a lot of people that are in favor of this particular project and want to see it move forward, because they are definitely wanting to make sure that the ethanol industry is sustainable, we move forward, and we grow. We provide jobs for the people of the state of South Dakota. I look at what this bill, what this taxation will do for the district that I represent. Again, District 22, Beetle, Spink, and parts of Clark County. They will provide $3.8 million of annual revenue that they can distribute and utilize however they want to. If I didn't work for those folks and I turned away $3.8 million, I wouldn't be working on behalf of the constituents back in that district. I work for the people of the state of South Dakota. I represent the people of District 22. What we're doing is the right thing by allowing 201 to be able to move forward and protect and move the state forward economically.
Thank you. Rebuttal?
So the other side likes to talk about lowering the CI, and they like to talk about sustainability. I think everybody here has heard of GEVO. You know, the interesting thing is GEVO was planning a plant that they were going to build. They were going to buy corn, and they were going to buy CO2 off the pipeline. They weren't going to sequester any CO2. According to the rules, they could make SAF out of both corn ethanol and methane and CO2. So if this can be done with GEVO, why can't the ethanol plants do this at each and every ethanol plant? The simple fact of the matter is, yes, they can. And this goes to what I was saying before. We're talking about a lot of money to invest, but in order to be a necessity for eminent domain, it's not that, oh, gee, this is the cheapest thing, because let's face it, if it's the cheapest thing, if that's all the bar you have to meet in order to do eminent domain, it's always going to be cheaper to steal somebody's property or property rights in order to do business. The return will always be higher. The simple fact of the matter is there are plenty of opportunities for them to be sustainable, to lower their CI below 50. We already have ethanol plants that are below 50. The simple fact of the matter is they want to do it with no investment, no work.
Thank you. Next question, please.
The next question is for Tim.
Tim?
What is going to hold the CO2 in the ground at the end point in North Dakota? Is there a saturation point for the amount in the ground, in North Dakota, and what happens at that time?
Is what keeps it in the ground in North Dakota?
Yes.
My understanding is they're going to use the CO2, one of my understandings is they're going to use the CO2 to put it back in natural gas reservoirs that are depleted. As a geologist, the natural gas that came out of those reservoirs has been there for a very long time, geologic time. The CO2 that goes back into those is going to be there in geologic time. We'll never see it again. Where they're going to put it, and I won't bother you with the technical names of where they're going to put it, from a geologic standpoint, it's rather safe. One of the questions I would have is, we have those same formations in the state of South Dakota. Why do we need to send it all the way to North Dakota?
Good answer. Are they going to reboot?
Sure, I'll give you each a minute to rebut if you want.
I spent a lot of time in North
1
Dakota.
minute.
Spent a lot of time in North Dakota. They plan to put this in the pore space, as Tim just walked us through, but that's a game. The game was that if they put it in the pore space, it could be deemed a public use. If they put it in the pore space, it cannot come out of the pore space for 12 years or they lose their payment of $85 per metric ton. And so the whole plan was to put it in this pore space long enough, and then once that time is up, then now the concern from the legal entity in North Dakota, because North Dakota has split mineral estate to the surface rights. And now they believe, reading the documents from Summit, that if Summit has anybody who buys from Summit, their agreement has the CO2 in the pore space for an 11-year period of time, the surface rights revert back to the owner of the pore space. And if the CO2 goes into the pore space, it cannot be used for enhanced oil recovery, and yet they will stand here in front of you and tell you it's all about enhanced oil recovery.
Time. Next question, please.
This question is directed to Doyle. Can the GREET model be challenged because of the Chevron oil decision?
I firmly believe so. The Chevron case was a Supreme Court case that allowed our government agencies to essentially write law. It allowed them to make all the rules. Congress could be very vague in how they legislated, and the executive branch could do all of the essentially dictatorial decisions, and Congress didn't have to pay the price for it. So when our Supreme Court reversed that Chevron case, I firmly believe that the fact that the GREET model it's actually being formulated as we speak. They aren't even done making this voodoo math up. The GREET model is done by the federal laboratories called Argonne Labs, and that is what is dictating to the ethanol plants, and they want to dictate to the farmers how we're going to farm, and they're going to dictate everybody how they're going to do this, and they're going to create they're going to put out tax credits, which these tax credits aren't your grandfather's tax credits. They don't get paid. You don't just cut your taxes. They get paid in cash. They are still determining how much is cash and how long they're going to pay them in cash. This whole thing is being made up as we go along. Congress did not write hardly any of this, and we need to band together rather than separately and fight together with ethanol in order to help save ethanol from the abuses that are being done to their rights as well.
Okay, thank you. Chevron law?
I'm going to speak to the GREET model. The GREET model is comprised, the score in the GREET model is comprised of three main components. The CO2 that's being released into the atmosphere right now, the farming practices that are on the farm, and in the production facility, the energy usage at the production facility. Another area that we have taken a hard look at is farming practices. And I'm going to go back to a question by or a comment by Mr. Turner earlier that says the reason we're signed up for this is because it's free. Of course. And he wouldn't be able to claim that he has never accepted something free in his lifetime. I'm sure he has. We all have. The farming practices is something that's coming, and it's coming fast to you folks, and a lot of you know it. There will be a day when you will be incented to farm certain ways, and if you're going to turn that down, what we're hearing is everybody is interested in this. Of course, it's another boondoggle, according to Mr. Turner, so he'll likely turn this down. But I'll bet all of his neighbors will be taking advantage of this premium that might be offered for farming practices.
Thank you. Next question, please.
This is for Mr. Chase. If I don't sign an easement, but my neighbor does, and there's a leak and my herd of cattle is killed, who pays for my losses? And is that a guarantee, or will Summit just claim bankruptcy?
Can you recite the question again?
Say it again. Read it again, please.
Okay.
Speak up.
If
Thank
I
you.
don't sign an easement, but my neighbor does, and there's a leak and my herd of cattle is killed, Who pays for my losses? And is that a guarantee, or will Summit just claim bankruptcy?
If there's a loss due to the pipeline and casualties resulted of it, if it can be traced back, I would think that you could hold Summit accountable for that damages. I don't know for sure.
Could you?
That's a very vague question, sir.
Okay, we can hardly hear you back here. Could you repeat that, please?
If you have a loss that is deemed to be a responsibility of a carbon situation, I would think that Summit would be responsible for that particular loss.
They want to know if that doesn't sound like a guarantee. That's what they're asking.
I don't have that guarantee, sir.
Okay, rebuttal?
So, if past experience teaches us anything, when Denbury's pipeline erupted in Satarsha, there were all sorts of people who went to the hospital. There were people who had permanent health damages. They were lucky that nobody died. The reason nobody died was because theirs was not clear. Ours will be completely clear. Theirs had odor. Ours does not have odor. But not one single person got paid. Denbury took bankruptcy, and ExxonMobil paid just shy of $5 billion for their pipeline network when they came out of bankruptcy. Folks, I can tell you that coming from Iowa, I have a lot of experience with Bruce Rastetter. Bruce Rastetter has taken bankruptcy within his companies numerous times. He has done a very good job of grabbing assets out of the bankruptcy, and I can promise you with all assurity, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, that he has over 29 LLCs for a reason, folks, and that's to protect his assets. If we have a release of CO2, and I don't care if it's people or animals, if it's a significant amount of money, you're not going to get paid.
Next question.
This is directed to Jim Sire. What is deregistration and why are ethanol plants doing it? You may have to explain what deregistration is for those who are not aware.
As I hear deregistration, I think about ethanol plants that might be public filers with the SEC that are now deregistering because of the expense and the legal burden and things of that nature. That's what I'm thinking of. I don't know if that's what the question is about. Yeah, so that's exactly what I said. There's a number of entities out there that if you achieve a certain size or corporate structure, you can deregister from the SEC, avoid some of the legal burden and the legal costs of having to report quarterly to the Securities and Exchange Commission.
I would take that in a different direction because it ties into something that's bigger we haven't addressed here this evening, and that is the entire easement. In order to accomplish this, you have to sign an easement. And here's what I know. I know that nobody anticipated the resilience of South Dakota. And the Securities Exchange Commission thought sure that Summit would have this in the bag along with Navigator, but it turns out that some Midwesterners are smart enough to figure out a plume study despite testimony in peer, and that it's dangerous. But if you sign your land in an easement, at the same time, the Securities Exchange Commission was going to start a national asset trading scheme where if your land is signed up in that, they were going to sell that so the GEVOs of the world, owned by BlackRock and Vanguard, could actually take your land and here's the beauty of their whole system. They're going to tell you what to do with your property. You're going to continue to pay the mortgage at the bank, and you're going to continue to pay property tax, but they're telling you what to do while they sell your easement on the New York Stock Exchange.
I think you should
Next question, please.
Please repeat that question. I'm not sure that's a question or a statement.
Would Summit and the ethanol plants be trying to build the CO2 pipeline if there were no tax credits? That's a question.
Well, we've been looking at our CI score for many, many years. And at first, I think I can say this with a straight face. We thought that this wasn't going anywhere. And then as time went on, we clearly knew that it was going somewhere. And so the legislation, again, as I said earlier, the consumer demand is pushing this. I'll go back to my statements earlier about on-farm CI scoring. It's coming to the farm, folks, whether you want it to or not. It's coming, and there's going to be some sort of incentives for you to do so.
Rebuttal?
So, if you look at this from an economic model, I would love to see the Inflation Reduction Act go away. Unfortunately, there are I believe it's 60-some Republican legislators in Washington, D.C. that have signed letters that they don't want this to go away. I don't have any confidence that it will go away. So from my standpoint, our goal should be to take our children's and grandchildren's money and produce something. Don't stick it in a hole in the ground. We have an opportunity to produce an industry that will add value to both CO2 and the ethanol, the SAF, the aviation fuel. To give you an idea of the increased value, the cheapest form of energy is natural gas at $2.62 an MMBTU. SAF is over $82 an MMBTU. Folks, this is a real opportunity to at least take this money and do something. Build plants that will add value to it, not just throw it in the ground. I understand it will take a lot of capital. It'll probably be 10x of what they paid for their original ethanol plant. Well, what out there isn't 10x of what we bought in the last 20 years? Everything has gone up. So there's no reason that these people can't invest in South Dakota rather than just ship a raw material that has lots of value and dump it in the ground. I'm sorry, that is irresponsible. And by the way, I farmed most of my life. I never once was in the program, and I never once had subsidized crop insurance.
Next question, please.
This is directed to Mr. Kenyon. Does the different landscape and geological makeup of the land in Sartarsha, Mississippi versus South Dakota affect the likelihood of a break here?
To paraphrase, is the topography in Mississippi different than South Dakota? Is the ground different? Not really. Looking at the topographic maps from Mississippi, it's rolling hills, and that's a lot like eastern South Dakota. And that's why I brought up that spill, is because the likelihood that a spill here would somewhat mimic the spill there is substantial. So they're kind of the same.
I'll give you guys each 1 minute if you want to address. We'll start over here first. Do you have anything you'd like to say?
I'll cover this one. I've heard about Chautauqua, Mississippi so many times over the last 2 years, and I just want to set things straight. The pipeline break into Chautauqua, Mississippi was not a Summit carbon pipeline, period. It was in a hilly terrain. It was put in the ground less than 3 feet deep. It was not installed properly. There was a heavy rain event that happened that washed out the line and caused the issue of the breakage. The interesting thing is that they talked about it just briefly, but the important thing to remember is that there was hydrogen sulfide in with the carbon. Now, folks, that makes it even more deadly if it has an additional member to it. I could take those 2 bottles of water right there. If I had another bottle of water, I could put it side by side. They look alike. But if I dropped a few drops of cyanide in one, would one be more dangerous than the other? Yes, it would. The one with hydrogen sulfide would be much more lethal and dangerous. The thing that we need to keep in mind is that there's 5,300 miles of carbon pipelines, no injuries, no deaths.
Thanks. 1 minute.
Yeah, quickly, I'm sure everybody in here has at some point in time enjoyed a beer or a soft drink that is carbonized with CO2. More than 100 people each year in the world die from some mishandling of a CO2 container in a restaurant or cafe. The point is that there is an inherent danger, and that is when you compress it to 2,200 psi. Summit Carbon Solutions did not build Lake Nyos in Cameroon in 1976, but it still had a CO2 explosion in the lake. When the water and the CO2 combined, it came up, created a cloud, and killed 1,450 people and every living thing, including the insects. The point is, CO2 compressed in a pipeline going within 3 miles of somebody's house will kill people.
Thank you. Next question, please.
This is for Mr. Chase. Who will be responsible for the cost of training and any additional safety equipment needed by local and emergency responders? This person lives in Aurora, which will be near any pipeline path.
Thanks for the question. That's a good one. Summit Carbon Solution has indicated that they will provide a lot of training and a lot of information and materials available to local fire departments and first responders. Also, the tax dollars that are generated to those counties could dedicate additional resources to that, and it maybe would buy a new fire truck, more responsive equipment, and it just provides additional safety measures for those communities, those counties that would be along the route. So between Summit providing grants and resources for that, as well as additional tax revenue, counties could buy that on their own as well.
Thank you. Rebuttal?
Is that a for sure thing?
In order to accurately respond to this, he's talking about the small amount of money that Summit's going to pay. You need electric vehicles because your gas engines will not run there. They're going to have this pipeline for about 50 years in order to get enough money to pay for an electric fire truck. Folks, Summit isn't here to save the day. Iowa knows Bruce Rastetter all too well. If anybody has ever heard of Jack DeCoster, Jack DeCoster came into Iowa and basically made the biggest mess of a chicken ranch you could ever believe. It was literally a biohazard. Bruce Rastetter brought Jack DeCoster to Iowa. I'm telling you, I don't know why any ethanol plant would get in bed with a company that has such a horrible reputation, not to mention the fact that it's their competition. Bruce Rastetter owns 3 huge ethanol plants in Brazil. He's building another 3. Meanwhile, I know for a fact that there are ethanol plants on that line right here in the United States that are for sale. He's not selling them because guess what? Within their contract, there's a non-performance clause that if they aren't able to perform, he can take that ethanol plant. I'm telling you, I don't know why you would deal with somebody who is your competitor in this type of fashion, but that's what's going on.
Thank you. Next question.
This is directed to Jim Sawyer. Where did ethanol plants get their business model from? Taxpayers prop up their business how they want to, and now they want taxpayers' land. Where can I sign up my business to not pay taxes?
I could respond to that in a lot of different ways, including what part of agriculture isn't tied to the tax code. I mean, seriously, we've got bonus depreciation, we've got all kinds of things that we take advantage of, and this is really no different. This is an incentive for ethanol, which if you're a producer, if you're a landowner, if you're a shareholder, you're going to get part of that benefit. Glacial Lakes Energy is not a privately owned company. It's a publicly owned company owned by 4,200 shareholders, and many other ethanol plants are structured the same way. We pay dividends, we reinvest in the business, and we expand. And I would think that's what agriculture wants us to do.
Can I respond?
Rebuttal, yes.
So the goal should be to get as much subsidy as possible, correct? Well, folks, in order to make methanol out of the CO2, you have to create hydrogen. The subsidy for that hydrogen isn't some lousy $85 a ton, it's $3,000 a ton. So why aren't the ethanol plants going for the maximum amount of subsidy by producing methanol at their site? Then they can create that methanol into CO2 or into SAF, and the SAF, the carbon index on that is lower than the SAF on the ethanol. But if they blend the two together, it will get them to the point where you don't have to go out and farm a certain way in order to sell SAF out of ethanol. They can use the lower index from the CO2 SAF to make the index low enough on the ethanol. So if the goal is to get subsidies, let's spend the money, raise the capital, and build the plants so that we can maximize the amount of subsidy.
Next question, please.
This is for Mr. Sire. Why are you spending GLE investors' money to promote and fund politicians that support this pipeline when only 1/3 of your investors are in favor of it?
Well, I'd like to see those statistics. If that's a scientific survey, I'd like to see it. The reason we are spending the monies that we have is because this is good for us, it's good for agriculture, it's good for ethanol.
So I want to address sustainable aviation fuel because clearly it keeps coming up as the lifeblood for the ethanol business, which I don't believe. Ethanol can stand on its own feet. Livestock can't operate without the distiller's grains. I'm like Dole, I've never taken a dollar from the government, never been a part of a program. But I wonder how many people have really looked at what the USDA clarifies and defines you must be as a farmer to supply corn to an ethanol plant that will fuel a sustainable aviation system. 100% no-till, 100% cover crop, 100% highly efficient fertilizer. I spent 3 hours one night on the USDA website trying to define the definition of high energy fertilizer. It doesn't exist. National Soybean Growers, American Soybean Association, and their president lives just north in North Dakota, said that only 5% of the U.S. farmers can meet what they currently set as the standard, and it's a moving standard when the USDA doesn't even define what highly efficient fertilizer is. We do have a plant in Georgia that is currently making sustainable aviation fuel. I don't know how many of you know that. And the ethanol came from Brazil. And Summit Carbon Solutions is currently in the planning of building, with Honeywell, the largest ethanol plant in the world in the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana. Do not fall prey to these lies and these dangling carrots, because the rat never knows why the cheese is free until it's too late.
Next question.
This is for Mr. Chase. Why do you and others favor the RL21, taking county commissioners' control who represent the people out of the picture. Should we then take the representatives and senators, congressmen, and government out of the picture and go right to the federal government to make decisions?
Again, I've served 8 years as a county commissioner in Beetle County. And I take this very seriously in saying that when counties overrule and overreach their bounds, it's probably not going to work out in favor of them. They're going to be overruled at some point down the road. Again, we talk about the federal regulations. I wanted to go back to this particular paragraph. When people, routes are planned, regulations and safety concerns dictate that when creating routes, planners avoid houses and buildings as much as you can. As opponents go to counties to create ordinance and dictate setbacks, claiming they're improving safety, they need to understand that the county ordinances are going to fail by federal law, as it is settled in law that only the federal government, such as through PHMSA and the Department of Transportation, have exclusive jurisdiction when it comes to pipeline safety. In Iowa, 2 different cases of county ordinance were preempted, and it was specifically cited by the judge that counties cannot use the safety argument. Folks, you've got federal law that's going to supersede whatever rules and regulations you come up with counties. You have to understand that the Public Utilities Commission is going to be the one that's going to dictate whether the permit is issued on this particular project. And they're going to use federal law to determine how these things are sited and what the setbacks will be. Let's move forward with building the pipeline. Vote yes on referred law 21. I thought that's what we were here to talk about tonight.
Rebuttal?
I think what Roger is misinterpreting here is the difference between siting and safety. In the form, it talks about siting, which is deciding where the pipeline will be going, is a local concern, state and local. Safety is the responsibility of PHMSA. They are not the same thing, and it would be nice if somebody who was writing our laws had better comprehension of what he read.
Next question, please.
This is for Mr. Kenyon. This person wants to know about emergency response. How are small volunteer responders going to handle a leak rupture that can be rescue? I can't quite make out that word. If they can be rescued within the zone of breakage?
So to rephrase, how do first responders handle a release? There's nothing really you can do except move people out of the way and wait for it to disperse. Unlike some other releases where you tell people shelter in place, for a CO2 release in a mass casualty event, that doesn't work. Sheltering in place is a bad idea. For portions of the plume. The only thing you can do is move people out of the way until it disperses. And that's a very difficult thing to do on a mass casualty.
Give you each 1 minute to rebut.
This is exactly why Representative Kim Coates called me, because all of the training with your local volunteer fire departments, all first responders, CO2 is a completely different animal. That's why you can't talk about gas pipelines. That's why you can't talk about any other pipeline we've had before, because of the reasons Tim Kenyon walked through. It is handled differently, it disperses differently, and it seeks low-lying areas, and it's 1.5 times heavier than air. It does not fit the model on any of their existing training, which is why it poses an additional threat that they don't know what to do with at this point in time. It's going to be a whole new level of training for every first responder unit.
Well, thank you for the question. And South Dakota currently has 4,700 miles of pipelines running throughout the entire state of diesel fuel, refined gasoline, natural gas, crude oil. Studies show that pipelines have a clear environmental and public safety benefit over transporting by rail and are 70 times safer than shipping fluids and liquids by truck. Now, this article from Charlie Kirk, president of South Dakota Firefighters Association, put it bluntly. With CO2 compared to your natural gas and your other liquids, those are flammable, whereas carbon is not. It's going to dissipate we use carbon dioxide in fire extinguishers and other extinguishing agents. The facilities all across the country, and so with the concern of explosive hazards, the fire hazards, that's not a concern compared to other pipelines. So this is basically from Charlie Kirk, president of the South Dakota Firefighters Association, is not concerned about CO2 breakage or concerns with pipe explosions. He's more concerned about natural gas and fuel oil.
Thank you. Next question, please.
This is directed to Trent.
And I know it's not rebuttal, but when you talk about first response, that's why the dispersion modeling is so critically important, to have accurate dispersion modeling so that the local firefighters, local first responders can say, okay, the wind is blowing out of the northwest at 15 miles an hour and the release was at this point. These are the folks we need to focus on getting out of there and not dilute our efforts by someone that lives in the other direction. And that's the importance of not the setbacks, because one setback number doesn't apply. One size doesn't fit all. That's the importance of the dispersion modeling that needs to be done in advance. It has to be done to the best available science, and it has to be available at the very organic level to the first responders so they can focus their efforts on the folks that need to be focused on.
Next question, please.
This is directed to Trent Luce. Brookings sits on water. Is this pipeline going to cause a shortage of water here? We already have restrictions every summer.
So I'm glad we brought up the water use because we have failed to do that at this point. I'll let Jim be the rebuttal person because it has become common knowledge it takes 1/3 of the energy produced in a coal-fired power plant, and I'm told nearly 1/3 of the energy produced in an ethanol plant, in order to compress the CO2 to get it to 2,200 psi. It takes 300,000 gallons of water a day to cool this. As Tim told us earlier, it has to be below 87 degrees in order to be considered supercritical. Actually, it has to be below 87 degrees, between 87 and 32, simply to flow. Otherwise, it's at a gaseous state. The amount of water is of a dire concern. You already know that there are folks in northeast South Dakota, and then you have the whole situation with the Ellendale artificial intelligence system, which, by the way, this very day I found out the two guys, one named Zhang, one named Cummings, have a direct tie to Saudi Arabia as well. So I find it interesting that all of this Saudi Arabia ties come into South Dakota, North Dakota in this little corner, but the water use concern should be at what is going on in order to cool the CO2 to get it below the critical phase and to get it to where you can compress it, the amount of energy required to make that happen. If you're producing energy and a full 1/3 of what you produce is required in order to compress it to get it into a pipeline, I don't consider that efficient.
Those of you who know me won't know that I won't make up things and I won't try to impress on things I don't know the topic. But I do know for fact that we use about 2 to 2.5 gallons per gallon of production. We use about 2 to 2.5 gallons of water at each of our plants. Of course, the larger plants are more efficient, the smaller plants not so much. We feed the Mina and Aberdeen plants from Webb Water. We feed the Watertown plant from Watertown Municipal Utilities, and we feed the Huron plant from Huron Municipal Utilities. We have had discussions with every one of those providers, and not one of them has expressed a concern over whether they can meet those water needs.
Thank you. Next question, please.
This is for Roger. If RL 21 does not pass, will that kill the pipeline project?
If RL 21 is killed, no. It has no impact on whether this project moves forward or not. If we lose referred law 21, it takes out all of the protectionisms for the landowners as well as the taxation availability for the counties to do that. So this has nothing to do with the permitting, eminent domain, or whether the project moves forward. If referred law 21 goes down, we lose all that protectionisms and all the good things that come along with it as far as the depth of the pipe, the plume studies, all of not the survey, but the plume studies, the depth of the pipe, whether the land agents in South Dakota are licensed in South Dakota or South Dakota residents. It takes away all of the benefits that we have in referred law 21. That's why it's important not to see this be defeated. It has no impact one way or the other whether the pipeline is going to be built.
Rebuttal?
Despite what the PR firm that sat down with Governor Kristi Noem and this group of legislators told them, that however many times you can repeat that this is the landowner's Bill of Rights, nobody is actually going to believe that nonsense.
Powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by the states.
Okay, next question, please.
This is directed to Doyle.
What's that say? Please help.
Will lowering CO2 in the air also lower the bushel per acre of crop production?
Historically, we are not at a high level of CO2 in the atmosphere. Actually, we are at a low level of CO2. Optimum is nearly double what we have. The simple fact of the matter is the vast majority of our CO2 does not come from man. It comes from natural occurrences such as volcanoes and other geological events. We've gone through a pretty good period of not a whole lot of geological events compared to history. But CO2, as has been said before, is most definitely fertilizer. And if we take this to its idiotic extreme that it appears Argonne Labs wants us to, we will most definitely be buying CO2 to put on our crops as fertilizer. I will also say my father owned a fertilizer business, and he said in the 1960s he never once sold sulfur. And then as they kept making the coal cleaner, well, we needed a pound to the acre, and then 2 pounds, and then we're up to 15 and 20 pounds.
Stop.
And that's where we're going to be with CO2.
I'm going to tell you right now, the ethanol plant in Huron is 1 mile from our farm, and we do have farmland located a half mile away. We use the same farming practices on that land as we do on land that's 15 miles away. It has no bearing one way or the other. There's enough CO2 in the environment, and that's what we're trying to capture and reduce. The air that we all breathe each and every day, we want to make that cleaner and more viable for generations to come. There's enough CO2, even if we capture it and put it in a pipeline. Don't worry about it. There's enough CO2 for crop production around this area.
Thank you. Next question, please.
This is for Mr. Chase. If the pipeline is so safe, why not just run it by the interstate? Then you wouldn't have to deal with eminent domain.
Can you repeat the question?
Well, there's a couple scratched out words, so I'm doing the best I can. If the pipeline is so safe, why not just run it along the interstate? Then you wouldn't have to deal with eminent domain.
Well, folks, like I've said, there's 4,700 miles of pipelines in South Dakota right now that's actively carrying crude oil, fuel, natural gas. Can you imagine all of those pipelines that have been constructed and bringing natural gas and energy to your property, providing diesel fuel and gasoline to your cars that get distributed in my district? The KNEB pipeline right there south of Woolsey for 50 years has been bringing in refined gasoline and diesel fuel. It gets distributed out to trucks. Folks, can you imagine building the interstate highway system today with all the federal regulations that we have? It would be impossible. Thank goodness we did it back in the 50s and 60s. This is moving forward, and this pipeline is getting far more scrutiny than any project that's ever been done in the state of South Dakota. To me, it's a safe project. We're running it through a pipeline. They have safety standards in place. Let me give you a good example. The Trans-Canada Pipeline basically runs through northeastern Beetle County. There's a pumping station. A year ago, I got a telephone call on a Monday morning that somebody had shot the transformer at that particular pumping station. It took the power out. Immediately what happened is that sensory in that pipeline dictated that there was a problem with the power at that pumping station. It sent off automatic retracements back through that pipeline to make sure that that oil flow was slowed down because they knew there was an issue. And in this particular project right here, they have braking areas every 15 miles, more frequent in metropolitan communities that are set there. Folks, this is a safe project. If they find a problem within the pipeline, there's brakes. They can automatically shut that down and prevent that from being a problem. We need to move forward.
Rebuttal?
Roger did a really good job of explaining why the South Dakota Supreme Court found that this whole thing is unconstitutional with eminent domain. Because the pipelines that he discussed actually have a public use. This does not, just like the South Dakota Supreme Court said. It's really interesting that eminent domain is the real topic here, because the state that has the most voluntary easements in this whole project is Minnesota, with 90%. Now, if you had a state with 90%, wouldn't you be saying, gee, I'm doing something right, maybe I ought to do that in the other states? You want to know what the difference between South Dakota, Iowa, and North Dakota and Minnesota is? Minnesota doesn't have eminent domain. Folks, if they hadn't gone after eminent domain in all of these states, they'd have a pipeline. It would be done. It might not be straight, and it might not be quite as efficient, but you know what? They'd have it. But they decided that, you know what, we're going to steal people's property rights. We're going to force them to do this. And this is Bruce Rastetter's MO all the way. This is how he plays. This is the bully tactics that he uses. They go out, they lie to old people. They do all sorts of unscrupulous things. We do not want somebody who has this type of lack of moral character running the most dangerous pipeline in the country when he's never owned or built a pipeline before.
Next question, please.
This is directed to Jim Sire. Because CO2 pipelines offer no actual product that is economically viable, where do pipeline companies obtain their revenue?
I have no idea to the answer to that question, but I do want to challenge Mr. Turner. If Northern Iowa wants to join Minnesota, I'm glad he can do so. We don't want to do that in South Dakota.
Rebuttal?
Could you repeat the question?
Certainly, because CO2 pipelines offer no actual product that is economically viable, where do pipeline companies obtain their revenue?
Well, I think Jim is being a little disingenuous, because I think Jim knows completely where they get their revenue from. 100% of their revenue comes from the federal government. It comes from you. Folks, they're using your money. Actually, it's not your money. It's your children's and grandchildren's money, because we blew our money a whole long time ago, and now we're going on to next generations to blow money on things that the reason they go to D.C. to do it is because no legitimate business would do this. Now, Cap CO2, the CEO there testified under oath at our IUB meeting last year, where he said that the subsidies are nice, but he can produce methanol from the CO2 profitably without the subsidies. So why, again, are the ethanol plants not producing a product to sell, but rather only taking federal subsidies?
Okay, next question, please.
I've got a couple questions. Two farmers from eastern Iowa called me the last 3 days to get the live stream for this, because they're very interested in what's happening in South Dakota, because the pipeline, from what I understand, will not continue in Iowa if South Dakota stops it. So they were very, I think they're watching right now, but they made a statement, but their question has to do with the hundreds of millions of gallons of water, and they're worried about their aquifers being depleted. That's kind of all I could, get from. They mostly made a statement, but I'm supposed to ask a question. So they do want to know how are the aquifers going to handle all the use that they're going to get from these projects.
Who's the question directed to?
The proponents, I would certainly assume.
Okay, we're going to let the geologist have a response here.
In South Dakota, aquifer depletion is governed by the Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources, the Water Rights Division. And South Dakota law says you can't mine water from an aquifer. And what that means is you can't take more water out of an aquifer than is naturally replenished. And South Dakota is a little bit unusual, and I've done a lot of work for the water rights folks in quantifying that. So depletion of aquifers is if you're worried about an issue, that's not the one to worry about, because we can only supply water from our aquifers at the same amount at which they're recharged, and that's state law, and they're on that one. So,
Give each of you 1 minute. If you have anything to say.
Water usage is something that's very important, and most of the ethanol plants are utilizing water from aquifers or from municipal sources. We thought this question might come up, and there is several ethanol plants already capturing and sequestering carbon in North Dakota, including Redtail Energy in Richardson, North Dakota, which has been doing carbon sequestration for more than a year. And Redtail Energy Management reports that they do not use any more water than they did before implementing CCS, because they're using an air heat exchanger to cool and compress equipment to use liquid CO2. The U.S. Department of Energy has estimated that the water usage used to cooling for CO2 compression to be a potential 10 to 15% additional water above and beyond what is typically used. So it could be anywhere from no additional change to up to 10 to 15% additional water usage, not doubling like some people are claiming.
Thank you for bringing that up, Roger, because I wanted to talk about Red Trail Energy, Dickinson, North Dakota, where I was at on Saturday. If you haven't heard, GEVO has just purchased Red Trail Energy for $210 million. In case you didn't catch it earlier, Red Trail is owned by BlackRock Vanguard. Doesn't have a lot of South Dakota tie there. But what I want to point out, and it is exactly what is at play today and why Referred Law 21 is vitally important. Red Trail Energy built something. Their board of directors built something. GEVO came in and purchased it and controlled the production, which is exactly what I see at play here with all of the ethanol plants on the path. You got Summit Carbon Solutions laying the groundwork so that they can capture the CO2, which is a valuable commodity, and then somebody's going to come in and buy it. What happened at Red Trail is fixing to happen on every other pipeline we're talking about.
Time. Next question, please.
This is for Roger Chase. Can you specifically tell me how RL21 will increase the price of corn?
RL21 basically keeps the law in place. If we can keep that in, that keeps more of a sustainable ethanol business and entities going throughout the state of South Dakota. If we look at how many bushels of corn, anywhere from every year we utilize 50 to 65% of our total corn production going through ethanol. Can you imagine if we lost the ethanol markets and all of those plants, demand for corn, what would our price be? And I remember back as a young man when I was graduating high school, my parents asked me not to go into agriculture because they said there was no future in it. Well, I defied them and I still went into it anyway. And I look at the future, looking forward, this is an opportunity for us to find that market and make sure that we don't lose 50 to 65% of our corn demand in the future. I think it's vitally important that we move forward and pass Referred Law 21.
Rebuttal?
Well, I would sure hope if you're going to get $3.71 for corn that you're only paying $3.50 for, I would sure hope it would save your industry. But I'm kind of thinking that if we did this for the cattle feeders and the poultry producers and the hog farmers, we might save them too. See, the future of agriculture isn't just big ag, it should be all ag. And if they aren't viable without these gigantic subsidies, I mean, Mr. Stiers has told us that there's this huge market demand. Then what do you need the subsidies for? If there's a huge market demand, I'm an ex-banker. I used to do large cattle loans, and then I went to doing small farmer loans, went through banking backward. I can tell you that if there is the demand that he's talking about, this is America. We have capital. And I promise you, if there's that kind of demand, the private industry would finance it. We wouldn't need federal government financing the entire thing. So once again, we are going to take our entire ag and make it reliant on all printed money from the federal government. I don't mind that you're taking subsidies. I don't mind that you use subsidies to build something, but we aren't building anything here. All this pipeline does is give Bruce Rastetter a monopoly on 98% pure CO2. And it's really amazing how the PUC has been, which is supposed to regulate monopolies because we don't have 5 natural gas pipelines coming to our house, and we pick whichever one's the cheapest. So we have this PUC to control the monopolies. They have perverted that entire process so that they can use the PUC to create a monopoly.
Thank you. Next question, please.
This is for Mr. Chase. Does Summit have approximately $20 million set aside for any type of mishap? If not, why not? I guess that would be called a bond.
Yeah, could you please repeat the question?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Does Summit have roughly $20 million set aside for any type of mishap? If not, why not?
Well, folks, I'll tell you this. I'm not a representative, nor am I employed by Summit. We're not talking about Summit Carbon Solutions. We're talking about Referred Law 21 tonight. And take away all of the conversations about, whoever Bruce Rastetter is, I don't care. I'm looking forward to what we can do to make sure that Referred Law 21 gets passed to where we can keep those protectionisms in place for the landowners and move this particular project forward. I don't know what Summit has set aside for liability or for any type of claims. It's not my business. That's not what we're talking about here tonight.
The flyer said
Rebuttal?
pipeline.
Your congressman just told you that protecting your property rights and protecting your life and protecting these things isn't important to him because obviously after 3 years or whatever, he doesn't know the answer to that question.
Okay. Next question, please.
This is directed to Roger Chase. The U.S. Constitution Amendment 10 states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved by the states respectively or to the people. Where in the U.S. Constitution does the U.S. government have the power to control state easements and safety?
I'm sorry, I don't hear those questions.
Okay, the control of state easements, is that right? State easements?
Has power to control state easements and safety.
Folks, I don't have the Constitution available in front of me. I don't know that very many people have it memorized. Mr. Luce over here probably has it in his pocket. He's probably going to recite all kinds of it, but I'm not going to respond to it. I'm talking about... Folks, we've been here for a long time. That's a staged question. I'm not going to answer it now. We're not going to respond to it. I'm sorry.
Okay. Rebuttal here?
Here's another part of the Constitution I want to talk about. We're here tonight because the forefathers in the state of South Dakota understood that an overbearing government could be as dangerous as a federal government. And in 1898, the state of South Dakota was the first state in this nation to start a referred law process. And they used it within the first 10 years. I want to tell you, as a person who is on television or radio every day, talking about how everybody's freedom and liberty hinges upon what is happening in the state of South Dakota, no matter whether you're in Alaska or Florida, is real. Do you know how many states people have learned because of the efforts of South Dakota that they too have the ability to have a referred law and do not need to have something thrust down the throat of the individuals in peer? And so that part of the Constitution, which is the state constitution, is what our founding fathers... Can you think about what it was like in 1898? And yet they said, we've got to have a way to protect our local, county, and township government. Thanks to the foresight of those early South Dakotans, we have a chance to maintain local control today in 2024 in the state of South Dakota, and every other state will follow suit.
Next question. Do we have another question?
I guess this is directed to anyone. If CO2 gas is sold in the future, will ethanol plants benefit from it?
Who would like to start?
I'll start. CO2 has 17 properties today that is going into the commodity marketplace. One of those I mentioned earlier, dry ice. One of those, you know, is to carbonize beverages. There are 7 enhanced oil recovery. There are places that are using CO2 at a 50% rate with natural gas to recover. I got an interesting story from a friend of mine in North Dakota who is in the business of buying CO2 and making dry ice that he then uses to clean radiators and different components in oil field Bakken rigs. He is currently buying CO2 from the state of Texas because he cannot afford to buy the CO2 that is in the state of North Dakota. Why? You already heard it from Doyle. A monopoly. There's a monopoly taking place, and there's a group of people that recognize that CO2 is a vital part of our energy future. And what is happening is that you have one company that happens to be based in Iowa that has figured out if they can get all of these contracts, and this has been my biggest concern for the ethanol business, falling prey to these contracts of signing up to give your CO2 to somebody that understands we're coming to the day where it has a tremendous value as a commodity, and that's really what we're fighting.
Roger, Jim?
So I suppose it was about 3-4 years ago, probably more like 4, I reached out to 3 national CO2 companies, and I got no response from one. I got a response from the other 2, and the answer was exactly the same. There's enough CO2 available right now. There are no new needs, no new demand for CO2. I'm sorry, we're not interested.
Okay. We have about enough time for maybe 3 or 4 more questions. And so let's get the next one coming.
Okay, this is for Trent. 48 inches deep seems pretty shallow, as the frost line frequently goes 60 inches, possibly more deep. Since frozen water can crack rocks, why wouldn't it also destroy a pipeline?
I have nothing to add to that other than kudos. I have asked from day one, why on earth would anybody be willing to put 2,200 PSI pipeline 4 feet deep in the Dakotas? I guess Roger's got the answer. He's been studying it for 3 years. You think this is a wonderful depth. I actually think it speaks to the depth that he spent studying the inherent dangers of CO2.
Roger?
The only response I'll have is that the agency that handles that, PHMSA, will be the one to monitor it, control it, and to oversee it. So I don't have any expertise in pipeline, but PHMSA does.
Another one.
Okay.
Got like 3 left.
All right, let's do a couple more questions.
I know it's silly.
This is directed to Jim Sire.
Some are
How many investors have land affected by the pipeline?
Can I get Tim one more?
There's some. I don't know the answer to that. It's a confidential number that we have no right to see.
Okay. Rebuttal over here.
So this kind of goes back to Roger's comment. Once again,
Oh, this one?
he doesn't understand the difference between siting and safety. While the Federal Energy Regulation Commission has exclusive authority to regulate the siting of interstate gas transmission pipelines, there is no equivalent federal agency that determines siting of all other pipelines, such as carbon dioxide pipelines. Therefore, the responsibility for siting new carbon dioxide pipelines rests largely with the individual states and counties through which the pipelines will operate and is governed by state and local law.
Okay, rebuttal.
You got one?
Oh, they started, sorry. Sorry. Okay, I think I'm going to make an executive moderator decision and we're going to wrap up. So I'd like to give everyone. Wait, before you leave, I'd like to give all of our panelists 2 minutes to wrap up their position statement. And I would like you guys to give these guys a round of applause after they speak. They all came here to educate you, and how many in the room feel like they know more than when they came in? Anyone? Good. That was the purpose of tonight. We're going to start with Jim Sire. 2 minutes.
Well, just again, this isn't a boondoggle as Mr. Tucker says it is. It isn't anything other than what the global demand is pushing our way. We have 2 choices here. We can either stick our head in the sand and ignore it and hope it goes away and then look back 10 years from now and say, what happened? Or we can join in and provide the consuming public a product that they are demanding.
Give them a round. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks for everybody for attending tonight. I don't know that anybody's opinion changed after what they heard tonight one way or the other. What I want to emphasize, folks, is that this particular referral to Law 21 has no impact on whether this particular pipeline gets permitted or not. The PUC will be the ones to make the determination on permitting. What referred Law 21, if it goes down, we lose 7 of the 15 Bill of Rights, and I'm going to go through those for you. Minimum depth 48 inches beyond, a foot beyond what PHMSA requirements are. Lifetime drain tile repair. Leak liability protection for the landowners. Indemnification for the landowners. Filing an ag impact mitigation plan that will be public to the people. dispersion analysis report disclosure, and require land agents to have a tie to the state of South Dakota or licensed within the state of South Dakota. If we lose that, we lose a lot of things that we've fought so hard for over the last 2-3 years in the legislature. It has nothing to do with eminent domain. It has nothing to do with permitting. Folks, we need to move forward. As for young producers like my son, I'm fighting for his rights. I'm fighting for the ethanol industry and the opportunities that they have forward. Again, I'm a landowner that's impacted by this. We've moved forward with it. Again, we did not cave in to Summit. We negotiated in good faith. They gave us an offer, we responded. They gave us an offer, we responded. Over negotiations, we finally came to a settlement that we feel comfortable with moving forward. And this particular pipeline will be within about 800 feet of a residential structure, our farm shop, and feedlots. I'm not worried about it, folks. We need to move forward. There's inherent risk of everything that we do. Every day or every week in South Dakota, somebody's killed in a car accident. We're all going to drive away from here tonight. That could be an accident.
Time.
Life is full of inherent dangers. Thank you.
In 2008, oh, I'm sorry, Tim.
I'm kind of in the middle here.
Were you just CO2'd or what was that?
My fervent hope is that, well, now the voters of South Dakota are going to make a risk-benefit judgment. And the legislature it's going to be on their plate in January, I'm sure. And I'm hoping we can make a valid judgment as to the benefit of this project versus the risks that it poses. There is going to be a CO2 release somewhere along this pipeline. I hope not. God, I hope not. But it's going to happen. I hope it doesn't happen here. And where it does happen, I hope they're ready for it. And again, keep that risk-benefit calculation in your mind. Thank you.
Now you can go.
The king in her court. I came and wanted to participate because I can't believe the amount of time I've spent on this topic and have said and will repeat, this is a hill I will die on. Because it's a violation of everything I believe in, which is local control and the ability for us to show up at our local township and county meetings and have input. What I want everybody to do going forward, no matter what you think, whether you think yes is the right answer or no is the right answer, I want you to be the advocate. In 2008, I was called to California because there was a ballot initiative on the California voters' general election in 2008, and that voter initiative was how much space a chicken should have in a cage. And my message in this group of 23 was that we in a presidential year cannot outspend what they're going to spend. We must win this by talking to our friends, our relatives, everybody we know. We cannot spend what Summit is going to spend to try to win this. But they don't have the grassroots that we do. And if each one of you accept the challenge to tell 10 people, as was evidenced by 38,000 people signing a petition and setting a high record mark on the number of signatures that were verified to be real, the vote will easily be no. And the answer is because you want to maintain control of your counties, of your family, of your communities, and make sure that future South Dakota generations will be here and proud to call this place home, because I'm certainly proud to come here and call you a friend.
So Roger said that he made an informed choice. And what he's also saying is that everybody else should make the exact same choice he did, and that you shouldn't have the ability to make an informed choice. What RL 21 does is it takes that choice away from the people, the very people that represent you, not only at the county level, but also at the PUC. Because when it comes to road permits, if the county denies it, it then gets pushed to the PUC, where the law specifically says they must pass it. So now not only did you lose your representation at the county level, but thank God you have elected PUC. We don't. Ours are appointed by our governor, who is bought and paid for by Bruce Rastetter, because he is our largest Republican donor in our state. But the thing is, you have a PUC that is elected, and they are taking the rights of them away also. They are going to take this all the way, and believe me, when Roger says he doesn't know anything about Summit, well, he definitely knows a lot about Summit's lobbying companies. You need to vote no on RL 21 because you need the ability. This does affect eminent domain because it hamstrings the PUC, and the PUC is the one that's going to decide if there's eminent domain. You need to vote no on RL 21 so that you and your local representatives are able to make the exact same decision that Roger took the liberty of making, his own personal informed decision.
Okay. Well, folks, you got a front row seat to public discourse in Brookings County. I thank you for joining me tonight. Please thank these 5 men for being here to educate you. Have a good night. Drive safe.